Every once in a while, a movie manages to come out and establish itself not only as a good film, but as a snapshot of a particular time period and setting. Movies like Fast Times at Ridgemont High capture the feelings of going to an American high school in the 80s, while films like An Elephant Sitting Still portray the realities of living in modern-day China. These types of movies rely on lived experiences, and an insight into these worlds to evoke their feelings of authenticity can include lots of research when the filmmaker doesn't come from the background and experiences they're depicting. Such was the case with the 1995 film Kids, a directorial debut from already established photographer Larry Clark. Kids thrives in its authentic depiction of teenagers hanging out in the streets of New York in the mid-90s, exposing this subculture to the world, albeit through some problematic framing. Kids follows two friend groups during a 24-hour time period in their lives. There's Telly and Casper, two 17-year-olds who are obsessed with having sex with virgins, as they claim it's the safest way to have sex because there's no risk of contracting any diseases. Then there's also Jenny and Ruby, two friends who've come back from a sexual health clinic and discovered that one of them was diagnosed with HIV. Now, in 1995, an HIV diagnosis was basically a death sentence, but another important thing to note is the stigma around HIV at the time as well. At the time the movie came out, HIV was a virus that was mostly associated with gay men, and not something that straight people really put much thought into. Depicting HIV as something that affects straight people too was important for the time to deconstruct the preconceived notions around this illness, and whether it was added into the story for shock value or not, the film deals with HIV competently and broadens the public's perspective on it. Anyway, the girls then go looking for the guy who gave her HIV, which coincidentally happens to be Telly. During the day, the characters drink, do drugs, and get into fights on the streets of New York, and I think now would be a good time to look into how the movie managed to stay so realistic to the real situations of the kids depicted in this film. Having already worked as a photographer who specialized in young subcultures and communities, often focusing his camera on drugs, sex, and violence, and wanting to make the Great American Teen movie, Clark had no problem setting out to learn about the skating subculture at the time. In an interview, he said, "I wanted to present the way kids see things, but without all this baggage, this morality that these old middle-aged Hollywood guys bring into it. Kids don't think that way. They're living in the moment, not thinking about anything beyond that, and that's what I wanted to catch." But Larry Clark couldn't just observe, he needed an in, something that would make this community trust him, and he found it in a 19-year-old Harmony Korine, a now renowned filmmaker known for his experimental approach to filmmaking in movies like Gummo and Trash Humpers. They found each other while Harmony was skateboarding with some friends in Washington Square Park, and impressed, Larry asked him to write a script about these skater and teenagers he knew. Harmony jumped at the opportunity, and in 3 weeks, produced the script that would become Kids. Although the film feels highly naturalistic and improvised, both Harmony and Larry say that the majority of the film is a line-for-line reading of the original script. In order to find actors for this project, flyers were made and handed out in the parks and streets in New York, reading, "Real NYC Kids, all backgrounds and colors, no acting experience necessary." They did look for real actors as well, but mixing them with the skaters and street kids they found proved to be a challenge, and they ended up taking most of their cast from skate parks around the city. And to be honest, they found a really impressive cast for such a project, all of whom were first-time actors, but most of which ended up making something of their career. Leo Fitzpatrick was selected off the streets for the way he sweared when he failed a trick, and also went on to make 2 more films with Larry Clark, as well as more recently having a role in the miniseries Maniac. Rosario Dawson was found as the crew walked down an alleyway and heard her singing on a balcony. Harmony introduced himself and the idea for the film, and she pretty much agreed right after. Rosario Dawson is of course known for her roles in Josie and the Pussycats, the Clerks franchise, and more recently Ahsoka Tano in the Star Wars franchise. Justin Pierce was also found on the streets of New York. Raised in a single-parent household, Justin had already dropped out of school and begun living off of his earnings stealing cigarettes and food. He was living in abandoned basements around the city, often with a group of skaters, and had already been arrested for possession of marijuana and heroin. After the film, Justin would win an Independent Spirit Award for his portrayal of Casper in this movie, and he'd also go on to play the character of Roach in Next Friday. Mia Kirshner was scheduled to portray one of the leads of the film, but due to some conflicts with the director, she was fired right before production began. Harmony asked his longtime friend Chloe Sevigny to step into the role, and she was thankfully the best choice. Chloe Sevigny would of course go on to be in American Psycho, Boys Don't Cry, and Zodiac, as well as a few other films directed by Harmony Korine. And last but not least, Harold Hunter, an already professional and established skateboarder at the time, played a version of himself in the film. With the cast completed, they were ready to start shooting, but before we get into the production, I'm going to read this quote from cinematographer Eric Edwards about Larry Clark's perspective on making the film. Larry's whole position was that this is what kids were fucking doing, and parents don't know this, and they should know, so Larry was going to show, I don't want to say the darker side, but just a more truthful side of what kids were about, what kids were doing. He just wanted to expose it and explore it in a raw way. Now, just remember this before we will come around to talking about the ethics of this approach. The production of Kids was tricky, to say the least. The scenes mostly took place in the street or in an apartment, so since this was provided by the city in surplus, the most troubles came from working with the cast. Since production took place in 1994, they couldn't simply text the cast, and some of them didn't even have permanent addresses. So at the beginning of every day, the production crew had to hunt down all the actors individually. Call sheets for the next day were often made at the end of the day before, so every morning became a hunt in New York to find the cast. They would purchase beepers to more easily communicate with the cast, but even those were lost at a rate of 2 to 3 a week. Larry's biggest individual problem with the cast, however, came from Justin Pierce. Having already been suffering from substance abuse and arrested before, Justin's personality really helped this character feel as real as he did, but caused nothing but problems for the crew. One day while shooting, some of the actors had gotten drunk, which culminated in Justin hitting someone and threatening to commit suicide in jail, something that resulted in him spending 2 nights in a cell. Leo Fitzpatrick remembers, I've always been curious if that wasn't on purpose. He wanted to keep that film going. Another incident, which occurred while filming in a nightclub, ended in a fight with Larry after Justin was caught stealing bottles of alcohol from behind the counter. Another incident, one that worked in the production's favor however, was in the scene in which Casper and some other kids do Whip It. When it came time to shoot, Justin, who had never done Whip Its before, just got in front of the camera and did them. The incident does however reveal another big problem on set, which was the environment created for its young cast. Everyone knew Larry wanted reality, and in doing so, cast members felt more and more comfortable bringing and doing real drugs on set, away from parental or adult supervision, and allowing themselves to be filmed doing so. And while I think this approach is already a little morally gray with adults, it definitely becomes so when you're working with kids, some of which were only 12 or 13 at the time. In the end of the film, during a party scene, 3 young boys pass a joint in between them, a real moment that was caught on camera and placed in the film. At this point in production, some members of the crew had already had enough and reportedly walked off set. At this point though, it didn't matter. Production had wrapped, and with some help from the band Folk Implosion for its soundtrack, Kids was ready to be released. Kids premiered at the 1995 Cannes Film Festival and received mixed reviews from critics. It was applauded for being an authentic portrayal of this subculture at the time, but also criticized for feeling exploitative, and to be honest, I can understand both opinions. The depiction of the day-to-day life of these kids was already pretty shocking for the time, but I think it's fair to be critical of Korine's script, as it does feature certain uncomfortable conversations about sex that go on for a weird amount of time. Despite this, Kids has become a cult classic, and continues to live on as an infamous must-watch for pop culture and fans of disturbing cinema. But the story of Kids doesn't end here, unfortunately. Just 5 years after the premiere of Kids, Justin Pierce took his own life while staying at a hotel in Nevada at the age of 25. 6 years later, Harold Hunter, at the age of 31, would die of a cocaine-induced heart attack. I quoted Larry in the beginning of the video about wanting to expose the truth of what kids were up to when their parents weren't around. In doing so, he not only created an environment in which young kids weren't just comfortable, but were almost encouraged to continue abusing drugs and getting into fights, without putting much effort into exploring why some of these kids turn out the way they do. Former cast members have since criticized Larry and the crew about feeling exploited by the film, exposing them to the world in their lowest state, and not receiving nearly as much money or credit as the filmmakers did. There's a documentary called We Were Once Kids by Hamilton Harris, someone who had a brief appearance in the film, that goes in depth about the treatment of the actors by the filmmakers. The documentary seems to conclude that the release of kids, as well as Harmony and Larry, are directly responsible for the deaths of Justin and Harold. While I disagree that either kids or Harmony and Larry are solely responsible for their deaths, I do think it raises a lot of interesting points about how Harmony and Larry were more interested in portraying these situations to the world without really wanting to understand or fix them, which can feel a bit uncomfortable at times. What do you think about Kids, and how old were you when you first watched it? I think I was around 16. If you learned anything new about the production of the film, has your opinion on the film or the filmmakers changed in any way? Let me know in the comments down below. I'm always interested in hearing more. That's pretty much all I have to say for now, so enjoy the rest of your day, and peace.